What do you do when the only thing left of someone you loved is a horse they left behind? The question wasn't something Alara ever said out loud. It was just there, a cold, hard stone in her chest where her heart used to be. As she crunched through the frost-rimed grass toward the stable, the air was a physical thing, a sharp metallic cold that stole the breath and painted the world in shades of iron and glass. Every branch of every oak and ash was encased in a crystalline sleeve, glittering under a sky the color of bruised slate. The world had iced over, silent and waiting. It felt appropriate. Inside the stable, the cold was a different kind. Less biting, more damp. The smell was a familiar comfort she didn't want to feel. Old wood, sweet hay, the warm, musky scent of animal. Dust motes danced in the slivers of gray light cutting through the boarded windows. This had been her uncle's place, his sanctuary, and now it was hers, an inheritance of quiet and responsibility she hadn't asked for. She moved down the aisle, her boots whispering on the stone floor. The other stalls were empty, doors gaping open. Their occupants sold off to pay debts she hadn't known existed. All except one. At the very end, in the largest stall, a shadow shifted. She stopped a few feet from the iron bars. This was the thing that was left. The Welsh pony. He was smaller than she remembered from childhood visits. A dappled gray with a dark, tangled mane, and eyes that held the deep, unsettling stillness of a mountain tarn. He didn't startle or whinny. He just stood there, watching her, his breath pluming in the chilled air in steady, quiet clouds. His ears were pricked forward, not in welcome but in assessment. A patient, ancient assessment. Alara leaned against the post, the wood cold even through her thick jacket. She had nothing for him. No apple, no sugar cube. She'd forgotten. The emptiness in her felt like a vacuum, sucking away all practical thought, all simple kindness. What was the point of any of it? The lawyers had talked about assets and estate planning, but all she could see was the empty chair at her kitchen table, the silence on the other end of a phone line that would never again be answered. The pony took a single step forward. His hoof made a soft, hollow sound on the stall floor. He lowered his head slightly, his nostrils flaring as he sampled her scent on the air. She could see the fine muscles along his neck twitch, the way his coat shivered against a cold she knew he couldn't truly feel, not with the thick winter coat he wore. He was built for this, for harsher things. She didn't reach out. She just stood, a statue of grief in a silent cathedral of loss. She expected him to lose interest, to turn his back to her and return to his hay. That's what she wanted, if she was honest. To be alone in this feeling, to let it consume her without an audience, but he didn't move away. He took another step, then another, until he was close enough that she could feel the radiant heat from his body, a startling warmth in the cold stable. He stretched his neck and she flinched, expecting a nudge, a demand for the treat she didn't have. But he didn't touch her. He just brought his soft velvet muzzle to a point in the air about an inch from her sleeve, and he breathed in, a long, deep sniffing breath that seemed to take in everything about her. The salt of her tears, the wool of her coat, the scent of her city apartment still clinging to her jeans, the profound sadness that was pouring off her in waves. He understood. She didn't know how she knew it, but she did. He understood stillness. He understood waiting. He understood the weight of a silence that was too heavy to bear. Slowly, so slowly it was almost imperceptible, he lowered his head until his chin was resting on the top rail of the stall door, right next to her hand. He wasn't looking at her anymore. His eyes were half-lidded, gazing at some middle distance in the dusty air. He just rested, as if her presence was not an intrusion but a fact, a part of the landscape of his day. The stone in Alara's chest didn't dissolve. It didn't magically disappear. But for the first time since she'd gotten the call, the silence didn't feel entirely empty. It was filled with the sound of his breathing, the soft sigh of his exhalation, the steady, solid beat of his great heart. She didn't know how long they stood like that, two creatures held together by a thread of shared quiet. But eventually the cold began to seep deeper into her bones, and the practicalities of the world, the drive back to town, the empty house, began to pull at her. She pushed herself away from the post, her body stiff. I'll be back tomorrow, she whispered, the words feeling foolish and inadequate in the vast quiet. She turned to leave, expecting to hear the rustle of hay as he moved away. She took 3 steps, 4, her own footsteps sounding terribly loud. Then she stopped, because she heard it. Not the sound of him moving away, but the soft, deliberate sound of a hoof on stone. Then another. She turned her head just slightly and looked back. The pony had lifted his head. He was watching her, and as she stood, frozen, he took a single careful step forward in his stall, his body parallel to the door. Then another. He wasn't turning away. He was following her, not with a frantic energy, but with a calm, deliberate pace, his dark eyes fixed on her, as if he'd decided, for reasons of his own, that she was not someone to be led out of his sight. The days after that first visit settled into a fragile, silent rhythm. Ilara would come in the morning, her city-soft hands learning the rough texture of the hay bale twine, the satisfying clank of the water bucket. She would muck the stall, her movements clumsy at first, then gradually more sure. She named him, quietly, in her head, Brennan King. It was the only Welsh word she remembered her uncle teaching her a lifetime ago. The pony Brennan accepted her presence with the same quiet gravity. He would eat while she worked, sometimes pausing to watch her with those deep liquid eyes, but he never again followed her along the stall. That one moment felt like a dream, a secret between them. But there were other things, subtle, strange behaviors that pricked at the edges of her grief. It was the way his ears would flicker sharply whenever she hummed a particular, aimless tune. A habit she'd had since childhood, a melody she didn't even know she was humming until she saw him react. It was the way he would sometimes freeze, his head lifted high, staring toward the far eastern corner of the paddock where an old gnarled hawthorn tree grew, its branches now a skeleton of ice. He would stand like a sentinel for minutes, tense and listening to a world she couldn't hear, before shaking his mane and returning to his hay as if nothing had happened. Most of all, it was the trunk, her uncle's old sea chest shoved into a dusty corner of the tack room. Every time she had to pass it to get a brush or a rake, Brennan's demeanor would shift. If he was loose in the aisle during grooming, his head would come up, his nostrils would flare, and he'd let out a low, soft whicker, not of alarm, but of recognition. A deep, curious sound that seemed to come from the bottom of his soul. He would amble over to it and press his nose against the old rusted lock, breathing deeply of the scent of salt and old wood. It unnerved her. She found herself taking longer routes to avoid it, the unopened trunk becoming a monolith in the periphery of her days, a locked door to a room she was desperately afraid to enter. The ice storm that had been threatening for days finally broke with a vengeance. It wasn't snow. It was a relentless freezing rain that sheathed the world in a thicker, more dangerous glass. The wind howled around the eaves of the stable, a sound of pure fury. The lights flickered, died, and did not come back on. Ilara was trapped. The road back to town was now a lethal slide of black ice. Her phone had no signal. The stable was growing colder by the hour, the world outside dissolving into a gray, impenetrable whirl. She brought Brennan into the wide aisle for company, for the shared warmth of their bodies. She sat on an upturned bucket, wrapped in a horse blanket that smelled of him and of her uncle, and she cried, not the quiet tears of the past weeks, but great heaving sobs of pure terror and loneliness. The grief she had been holding at bay, the fear of this place, the crushing weight of the silence and the storm, it all crashed down on her at once. She was a little girl lost in the dark, and the one person who had always known how to find her was gone. She cried until her throat was raw, her body trembling uncontrollably. She was so lost in the storm inside her that she didn't notice him approach. But then she felt it. A warmth at her side, a solid, immovable pressure. Brennan had lain down on the straw beside her. Not like a dog, but in the way a horse does, legs tucked carefully beneath him. He curled his body around her shivering form, a living wall against the cold and the fear. Then he lowered his head onto her lap. The weight of it was immense, solid, and real. She froze, her sobs catching in her throat. She could feel the coarse strands of his mane under her fingers, the incredible warmth of his neck, the steady, powerful rhythm of his pulse. He made a sound then, a deep, rumbling sigh that vibrated through his body and into hers. It was not a human comfort. It was something older, more primal. It was the sound of the earth itself telling her to be still, that she was not alone, that the storm would pass. He stayed there, his head a heavy, sacred weight in her lap, his breath warming her frozen hands until her trembling stopped and her breathing slowed to match his own. She must have fallen asleep there, leaning against his warm, barrel-like chest, because she woke to an eerie, glittering silence. The storm had passed. A single shard of sunlight pierced through a crack in the door. illuminating the dust motes and the still form of the horse who had stood guard over her all night. Something had quieted within her. The frantic, sharp edges of her grief had been blunted. She looked at the trunk sitting in its dark corner, and for the first time she didn't feel fear. She felt a quiet pull. She walked over to it, Brennan following close behind her, his breath soft on her shoulder. The lock was old and rusted shut. It took a hard yank, and the metal hasp broke away with a squeal. She lifted the heavy lid. It didn't hold ghosts. It held a life. Neatly folded sweaters that still carried a faint trace of his pipe tobacco, logbooks of hikes taken, trails mapped, and on the very top a photograph in a simple wooden frame. It was her uncle, years younger, his face creased with a huge smile. And next to him a much younger, dappled gray Welsh pony, his head tossed back in what looked like laughter. Scrawled in her uncle's familiar handwriting on the mat were the words, "With Brennan on the Glitterow Ridge, he always knew the way home." Ilara's breath hitched. She turned to look at the horse, who was nudging a folded piece of oilcloth that had been tucked beside the photo. She picked it up, unfolded it. Inside was a set of detailed hand-drawn maps of the mountain trails, the safe paths marked in green, the dangerous ones in red. Her uncle's meticulous work. She understood then. The listening. The knowing. Brennan hadn't just been her uncle's horse. He had been his partner. His guide. He had carried the memory of every trail, every safe passage, every hidden path back to safety deep in his bones. Her uncle hadn't just left her a horse. He had left her a compass. Weeks later, the ice was a memory, and the first green shoots of stubborn snowdrops were pushing through the thawing earth. Ilara stood at the gate of the paddock, a halter in her hand. Brennan lifted his head from grazing and looked at her. Without a call, without a whistle, he began to walk toward her, his gait steady and sure. She didn't see a reminder of her loss anymore. She saw a keeper of a legacy, a living, breathing map to a future she had thought was lost. She slipped the halter on, not as a tether, but as an invitation. He lowered his head and nudged her pocket, not for a treat, but for her hand. She smiled, a real, true smile that felt unfamiliar on her face, and rested her forehead against the white star on his. The past was not a shackle. It was a trailhead, and sometimes the ones who carry you through the darkest storms, who lead you gently back to yourself, are the ones no one else saw coming. If this story found its way into your heart, then you know why we tell them. To remind each other that we are not alone in the silence. For more tales of quiet courage and the unexpected bonds that heal us, subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment below with the word Brennan if you believe in gentle guides. Press the bell icon so you don't miss our daily stories. We'll see you in the next video.